What long-held scientific assertions were refuted only within the last 10 years? Story 1. A draining lymphatic system of the brain was discovered in just approximately 2016. Before that, it was thought that there was no lymphatic system in the brain. Wild that we are still discovering major systems of human anatomy this recently. Story 2. The monoamine theory of depression, the theory that imbalances in things like dopamine, serotonin, GABA, etc., as the primary cause of depression. The prevailing theory now, I believe, is more related to how large amounts of stress physically damage certain areas of the brain. This can cause individuals who are vulnerable or have predisposition to develop depression or other mental disorders. Story 3. The exact timeline is up for debate, but the long-held Bering Strait Land Bridge theory for the original peopling of the Americas has been for the most part completely accepted as incorrect by the Archaeological Society at large, starting around 2015-ish. Findings predating the culture theorized to be associated with the Bering Strait land migration timeframe, termed the Clovis culture, have been continuously discovered since IRC the 50s, but were overall rejected by academics for the longest time. Improvement of carbon dating techniques in the 2010s, and further work at a number of important sites in North and South America have led to a body of evidence that is pretty much undeniable. The new theory is that the original peopling of the Americas happened before the Bering Strait land bridge was accessible. These people traveled likely by small boat and hugged the Pacific coastline, working steadily all the way down to current-day Chile. The most comprehensive site supporting this is Monteverde in Chile, which features clear remains of a settlement that predates the Clovis culture by approximately 1,000 years, and features remains of 34-plus types of edible seaweed that were found a great distance from the site itself, supporting the idea of a migratory marine subsistence culture. The revised idea is that this first wave settled coastlines and whatever parts of the continent were habitable, not still frozen over, and after the land bridge became more available, a second and possibly third wave of migration occurred that had limited admixture with the modern-day NA peoples, assuming they are the descendants of the first wave, that the descendants of the first wave didn't just die off. There's a lot of unknowns because of the limited number of human remains found dating back that far, and the fact that the bulk of likely site locations are now underwater. But as analysis methods continue to evolve, I'm sure there will be more discoveries made in the future. It's really interesting reading. I've been doing a deep dive into it lately just out of curiosity. Edit. Just wanted to add that I'm not saying the above new theory is fact, because it isn't. It's just what makes the most sense based on the evidence available. There's a lot of unknowns just because of limited archaeological sites, limited ancient genomes for analysis, limited diversity of remaining native populations to sample for comparison, limits to the capabilities of available technology, etc., etc., etc. In 20 years, I wouldn't be surprised if this gets massively revamped to accommodate new information, as it should be. Everything's a hypothesis in archaeology. Story 4. A long-standing conjecture in particle physics, supersymmetry, seems increasingly iffy based on the lack of evidence from the Large Hadron Collider. My understanding is that there are still some versions of it that are possible at even higher energies, but it was a big surprise that no new particles showed up so far. If you don't know about supersymmetry, you might have heard of string theory, which builds even further on supersymmetry. So string theory is also at risk of being experimentally disproven. Neither of these were ever based on experimental evidence so much as intriguing math, so technically they're not scientific assertions. But many very smart theoretical physicists basically took for granted that they would eventually be experimentally validated. Story 5. Turns out our connective tissue isn't just a bunch of thick collagen holding our organs in place. It's a bunch of interconnected sacs of fluid dubbed the interstitium. Yeah, basically, in order to see our organs on microscopic level, we would cut them open into thin slices, use chemicals to help fix the tissues together, basically preserving it, and then place these slices in between slides of glass. This process caused the fluid to drain out of these sacs and collapse, so the reason we never saw them before is that we have been accidentally destroying them every time we tried to check. Story 6. Nature versus nurture, or at the least it's more refined. Your DNA has several potential codes that may not be used in your lifetime because they have to be triggered with environmental events, food, abuse, challenges, trauma. All of those can trigger parts of your DNA over long-term events, resulting in a change of personality such as anxiety, depression, or antisocial personality disorder. And everyone has different genomes, so the same traumas can result in different personality disorders. So it's never nature versus nurture, it's nature with nurture. Story 7. Images from the James Webb Telescope have given us more evidence that shows we were incorrect about the previous guess we had at the age of the universe. Wording edited slightly from original, read replies for comments from people who know a whole lot more about science than I do, who can give you more info than just a little fun fact. Story 8. This one was 2012, but close enough. The University of Michigan came out with a study about how sweat glands impact the healing of wounds like scrapes, burns, etc. It was believed for a long time that new skin cells were created from the edge of the wound using the undamaged ones. But they found that sweat glands help secrete the new skin cells, and that they are coming up from the wound itself. It's why your hands might get really clammy if you've just scraped them up. Story 9. The CACO diet theory, aka calories in v calories out, or calorie counting. While it's theoretically correct that caloric deficit induces weight loss over time, it's not the number of calories, but the quality of the calories which matter most. And poor gut health can alter the way nutrients are absorbed, which means one cannot accurately measure their own calorie intake. Additionally, the quantity and quality of hormones like leptin, ghrelin, glucagon, and insulin greatly affect your body's metabolism. In essence, delineating the process of weight loss into a simple equation ignores the biological complexity of the human mind and body. Story 10. The low-fat, no-cholesterol, low-calorie, light trend basically fucked up an entire generation's idea of what is healthy. Cutting out good fats is one of the worst things you can possibly do for your health, especially when food products replace it with sugars. My dietitian told me this years ago, and nobody believed me until quite recently when articles began popping up about it. It's almost like the medical community has been insisting that simple, whole foods not cutting out this or that naturally occurring food element in the name of health, such as yolkless eggs or low-fat yogurt, are much better for you. Yet the food producers and diet advertisers have handpicked the doctors that'll say anything for a buck and/or a headline, anything to have you buy into their product. The high-protein fad is included in this. Get your protein normally, not from a bar that's 90% whey. Story 11. I know very little about it since it's not my field of study, and my sources are conferences on YouTube, from real biologists and scientists that quoted accredited sources, but still, don't take my words for granted. But paleontology and paleoanthropology have made huge steps forward in the last decade thanks to the introduction of ancient DNA sequencing alongside the good old fossil records. As far as I know, we have been debunking several things that we thought were set in stone, also proving the existence of the Denisova men, and that they interbred quite frequently with Neanderthals and sapiens. DNA studies also allowed us to give much clearer light to human evolution and geographic distributions. Fun fact, it seems that for several 10,000s of years, I cannot be bothered to look for the article. Sorry it's late. The sapiens population stayed at around 1,000 reproductive individuals. After that period, we reached Middle East and spread. That's the reason why all sapiens today are so genetically similar. Please, anthropologists around, correct my mistakes. Story 12. It was once commonly thought that stress, smoking, and diet were the principal causes of stomach ulcers. However, the Helicobacter pylori, H. pylori bacterium, is now known to be responsible for most duodenal ulcers and 60% of stomach ulcers. The H. pylori bacterium also prompts many symptoms of indigestion. Dyspepsia. In 2005, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren in Western Australia were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology for their pioneering work on Helicobacter pylori. In the words of the Nobel Committee, they were honored for their discovery of the bacterium Helicobacter pylori and its role in gastritis and peptic ulcer disease. Barry Marshall infected himself with the culprit bacterium as part of the research, proving its role in this pervasive disease. Story 13. Almost all psychological studies were proven to be false, including the bystander effect, where the New York Times simply made up the fact that no one called the cops. The Stanford prison experiment was also proven to be false because the doctor in charge of the experiment literally told the guards to be aggressive, but then pretended that the guards just became aggressive on their own. Story 14. This is more around 10-15 years ago, but paleoanthropological work and comparative anatomists found data that suggest humans never had a knuckle-walking ancestor. It seems that the other great apes independently developed their mechanisms for knuckle-walking independently from each other, and we actually began developing our bipedalism early on from an arboreal, ape-like ancestor that didn't yet have any specialized ground travel methods. I'd imagine it somewhat resembled a gibbon's shamble. Story 15. Coloring your hair uses to take 45 minutes minimum to process. Now it takes 15. And it can be applied faster too since it isn't as thick. I used to need 2 hours for them to color my hair, and now it takes 45 minutes in and out. It's wild. And ladies, if your hairstylist is not using this new processing stuff, look for one who is. It doesn't cost any difference, and it's actually saving the hairstylist money because she can get people in and out faster for the same price. Story 16. Ophthalmological research has changed what we thought we knew about vision and neuroplasticity. Many conditions previously thought permanent after early adolescence are now treatable in adults through vision therapy programs. This includes the correction of accommodative and convergence anomalies, amblyopia, strabismus, visual changes following CVA, etc. Individuals who have suppression are now able to turn on their suppressed eye and achieve stereopsis. It's a wild time in the field of ophthalmology. Story 17. For the longest time, it was thought that plants could only absorb simple small ions like nitrates at their root tips. But, TLDR, plants, 1, eat whole single-celled microbes with their roots, and 2, they attract them and foster a healthy population of microbes by releasing sugars and carbs into the soil. 3. This happens in a cycle, so plants are constantly fattening up microbes, partly eating them, and releasing them back into the soil to start the process over again. Basically, plants farm microbes as we farm them. So the mental model for how plants received nutrients used to be something like microbe eats organic matter in a process called immobilization. Microbe dies or releases waste, creating plant-available nutrients in a process called mineralization. Plant takes up simple ions. But in 2008, somebody at Queensland University discovered that plants actually absorb whole, living bacteria and yeasts at their root tips. Then, in approximately 2017, a guy named James White at Rutgers found that this root-feeding process happens in a cycle. So a plant attracts microbes by releasing tasty exudates at its root tips. Once inside, it strips their cell walls away by exposing them to the oxidizing O2. It absorbs their delicious bodies entirely or partially. And finally, it spits those that survive back out into the soil through hairs further up the root. Those surviving microbes venture back out into the soil to decompose organic matter and then find their way back to the root tip with its irresistible sugars and carbohydrate exudates. And the microbe gets reabsorbed by the plant to start the roller coaster ride all over again. So basically, plants are always farming microbes, attracting them, feeding them sugars and carbs, and keeping them alive, while we farm the plants. Some speculate that in natural systems or organic agriculture, a plant can get as much as a quarter of its nitrogen through this process. What's even stranger to me is that root hairs, basic plant structures we've all seen with our naked eyes and we've probably known about forever, only seem to form in service of this process. So in an environment free of bacteria, a plant forms no root hairs at all. The root hair seems to grow only in response to the presence of these single-celled cattle being herded through the periplasmic space in between the root cells. This seems to be important to plants, as evidenced by the fact that they'll spend as much as 75% of their photosynthetic products just to exude microbe food at the root tips. So basically, we discovered a microbe-plant interaction, which is arguably essential to all life on the planet only a few years ago. This discovery didn't require fancy microscopes. Just a bit of staining. If I understand correctly, we could have found this 100 years ago if we had been looking for it. Story 18. Neuroplasticity is finally being taken seriously. Previously, it was accepted fact that once you damage an area of the brain, that function is gone forever. Also was accepted fact that old people go on mental decline. Both have been proven false, the second only in the absence of disease. The brain can and does compensate and grow new neural pathways all the way up until death, and the elderly mental decline boils down to use it or lose it, and retirees doing nothing but watching TV is basically causing it. Same as if a marathon runner just stopped running. Story 19. We've discovered plasmapheresis does not provide benefit to transplant recipients before surgery. 5 years ago, it was standard to undergo plasmapheresis with assumption being knocking out a certain protein in amine systems helps promote immune system in not attacking new organ. Just learned this year standard of care is now to take a genetic panel which indicates whether or not patient will reject early as soon as it's placed. Crazy how things and entire theories change with evidence. Story 20. I am loving the response from the cosmologists and astronomers from the James Webb Telescope. It's like everything we thought we knew about the Big Bang and black holes and the birth, death of galaxies and stars was incomplete. I remember watching these documentaries as a kid when these new technologies like the Webb, VLT, and VLA were being built, and how it seemed so far away when they said they would be operational, and what they hypothesized could be the result in our learning. And now here we are with many in the field, and those of us in the community saying that a lot, if not all, of our textbooks have to be rewritten. As a mostly social scientist now in my career, I am fascinated to see the existential conflict some are having either accepting this or continuing to try to fit what we believed for so long into what the new data images are showing. The most interesting to me is when some keep reporting the age of the universe and how much time it's supposed to take for galaxies to take shape and grow, when massive galaxies that shouldn't be that size are being observed early in what we believed was the birth of the universe. Also, how certain elements thought to only come from supernovas were already present in what we perceive to be the earliest stages of stellar evolution. But we always thought it took much longer for a star to die out and explode to spread their star stuff. Beyond the micronova of our sun, and the impact it's having on Earth, this is the most exciting thing quietly happening in natural science right now, to me. With the conflict in academia with publishing for profit and agendas finally coming to a head, I am following how the seasoned cosmologists and astronomers will respond to and work with the new generations on at least agreeing on what we are seeing now. As a social scientist, it is yet another fascinating manifestation of the great work of the fourth turning from Strauss-Howe generational theory. Story 21. Coronary artery disease, which in some cases can manifest as atherosclerotic narrowing or stenosis of one or more of the coronary arteries, does not always mandate stenting or surgery. Previously, it was believed if a severe stenosis was present on angiogram, that the majority of patients should undergo stenting or surgery. But multiple recent clinical trials have shown that this benefit only extends to a select handful of clinical scenarios. Many patients can live with chronic severe narrowing without ill detriment, so long as minimal symptoms and/or dysfunction to their myocardium. We also continue to learn much more about the process of atherosclerosis and plaque buildup almost on a daily basis and how to prevent it. Story 22. Ego depletion. An extremely widely popular theory in psychology was that willpower and self-control are based on physical resources, specifically glucose intake, which can be worn down by engaging in difficult, effortful, or stressful tasks, and then replenished by drinking a nice lemonade or having some food. For a time, it was recommended that if you're doing a difficult or high-concentration task, you should have some sugary liquids to keep your willpower up, and therefore maintain higher performance. However, the criticisms began to mount, and eventually meta-analyses were conducted. That didn't find a lot of evidence beyond publication, bias, and then many labs. Replication projects began showing that although there is a tiny effect once in a while using certain measures, the overall pattern is very close to null. Story 23. It was long believed that early synapsids, the ancestors of mammals, walked with a sideways motion of the trunk-line lizards, because they have the limbs sprawled outwards vaguely like a lizard. Only later they change to an erect posture and a stiffer spine that bends up and down, like in many mammals. It turns out that synapsids were stiff-bodied and quite mammalian from the start, and that the bendy walk of lizards is a later specialization of the lizard lineage. All of that because we wrongly assumed, and still some do, that reptiles are primitive and modern mammals essentially evolved from creatures similar to modern reptiles. In fact, modern reptiles are as specialized to their particular ways of life as any bird or mammal is. Another example, crocodilians look somewhat lizard-like and are cold-blooded, so this must be a primitive thing. Their ancestors, however, were terrestrial, stiff, and tall-legged, and many peculiarities of the crocodilian anatomy resemble more the warm-blooded animals. It turns out that crocodilians are secondarily ectothermic, and that they ditched all their so-called advanced characteristics when they moved from the land to water. After all, For a tropical animal that sits in shallow water motionless and waits, maintaining a stable body temperature through high metabolism is just a waste of energy.